Gina, thank you very much for your warm welcome, and thank you too for welcoming us to your beautiful house and a garden that is in the making, you tell me. In the year when we celebrate the creativity and invention of the Olmsted and his firm, it's useful these days to situate those in the narrative or the longue durée of modern landscape architecture, which is my theme this evening. The name of planting fields was used about this area for a very long time before it was taken up and used for the house, gardens, and landscape that we see today. From the time when the Burns family, I have a very strange gizmo here, here we go. From the very first time when the Burns family built their house from 1906 and establishing gardens around it, to its acquisition by William Coe, destruction of the house by fire in 1918, to its uses as a learning institution, then to the present day foundation, it has changed. Sometimes we do not see or even want to see change. Yet over the years, things came to be altered for practical or for cultural reasons. New designers were invited to work and develop its gardens, like the Italian garden of 1916. And new interests and needs are emphasized, not least in the current opening of the house and gardens to the public. Changes happen. The heather garden that the Olmsteds established on the northern edge of the property have had to insert new French drains, an installation that we will not eventually see because they will be buried. But they are still a change, and some of the original heathers did not tolerate the site and are being replaced by non-heathers, which will replace them. Coe himself loved birds, and today that interest in ornithology has become more visible, with the establishment by the Coes of a chair of ornithology at Yale, and the creation of 2 bird houses on the grounds, which I have not yet seen and hope to do so, a project that was put on by artists 2 years ago. In the house, there was another change, a wonderful modern invention, because on my first visit to the house, I found in Mrs. Clo's bathroom where in those days when women did not indulge in such total immersion, this wonderful contraption that squirts water from the sides and, of course, probably did not bombard the coiffure, and it was a wonderful cultural move and a new thing of the time. The Olmsted's firm worked at Coe Hall for over a dozen years. Some of that work is palpable to the modern eye. They established the Karlshalten gates, planted ivy against some of the facades, and augmented woodlands, though these may be hard to discern today. They added the vista path and plantings around the azalea path. We have drawings of the projects they made, sometimes, and I like this one particularly, with scribbled sketches of alterations that they were thinking about outside the Karlshalten gates. The Cultural Landscape Report, commissioned by Planting Fields and delivered in 2019, wrote of the layered part of the site. It is that palimpsest that we learn to appreciate today as individual visitors and with more research to reveal those layers. Places change according to what its owners want to need or want, how cultural ideas enforce change, including aesthetic taste. The making of place, which is my subject now, was a coinage of the famous 18th century gardenist Capability Brown, and I've taken my title and its focus from that phrase of his. He was nicknamed for his delight in gleefully rubbing his hands and explaining to a client how a site offered capabilities for its improvement, and how he was himself quite capable of making a place better. He would come to be ridiculed by some, yet nonetheless the phrase he invented for himself was ideally suited to work that evolved in later years. Indeed, placemating seems to be a much better description of what later came to be termed landscape architecture, a term invented and formalized in the 19th century by professional bodies around 1900 in the States and in the UK. Brown made places, and he was good at it. Though it is often forgotten, he was an architect as well as a landscaper. So he is suspected to have designed this Grecian temple at Stowe, as well as the wonderful meadow down the valley below, which is often used to characterize Brown's work. I've done so myself, and I often use a very early engraving of it. Yet his contribution to placemating was very various. He is thought today to be the man who invented natural gardening. That is, if you really think about it, frankly ridiculous. If you garden, you invest in and shape natural materials. The word naturalization is plausible, but still for me, a confusing term. This moment in the Grecian Valley at Stowe is but one of his contributions to how garden history was conceived and promoted in England. Above all, as I shall show, what he did and what he passed along to later designers was to register different modes of layout in relation to others around it, often very different. And landscape, perhaps more than architecture, may conceal its different layers. What has been described as the park here may be truly in the lineage of Brown's characteristic modes of designing with nature. But planting fields is there to a remarkable awareness of garden history and its various garden forms. This includes the strong sense, as my pen colleague David Leatherbauer noted, that good gardening meant observing the identities and the differences in nature's products. It attends to both topography and to what a given client and his culture expects. It is indeed a well-explored topic, yet it is not a new perception. For Thomas Whately in the 18th century argued exactly the same, for different forms can be made present in the same landscape, and I quote, may to a degree be intermixed. Each is still a character of such force, which, whatever prevails, the propriety of other characteristics and of every species of beauty must be tied in conformity to this. Now, the Olmsted firm worked here between 1918, 3 years after Coe purchased the site, to at least 1937. But its beginnings were started by Boston landscape architects, Gay Lowell, with Andrew Sargent, who was the son of the sergeant who managed the Harvard's Arnold Arboretum. The Olmsted work is attested in some photographs from that period. But what is seen here to the bottom left is indeed the Italian garden that was created before their arrival. And its name, Italian, implies a far longer reach in landscape design ideas. So landscape architecture, as it is now termed, draws its ideas from an often eclectic narrative of design art, even as it seeks to revive and remake them in the present day. But as my friend Leatherbauer notes well, that idea has again a long history, which Leatherbauer has written about when he discussed the third Earl of Shaftesbury in the early 18th century, who argued in a dialogue of 1707 that he espoused a passion for me for things of a natural kind, and he regretted the conceit or caprice of man to spoil, by breaking in upon the natural order. But it was a dialogue. And the other invented speaker, invented by Shaftesbury himself, argued the contrary point, of which Shaftesbury was equally the author. Shaftesbury later used this frontispiece, which I'm showing you, as a frontispiece to his book called Characteristics of 1714. The engraving shows his garden at Wimborne St. Giles, and it shows close to the house the conceits of the garden that give way increasingly to a grove or wilderness and then to woodland. Another early gardenist comes with the appeal from the idea of genius of the place. This is Alexander Pope. In 1731, said, "Consult the genius of the place in all." And the lines that follow tell the different parts of the landscape, whether the waters rise or fall, what you're going to have with the hills, what you're going to do with scooping the theatres into a vale, how do you call in the country, and so on. And this range over a repertoire of landscape features, each of which argues, Pope said, must be observed the identity of that segment of topography. This genius loci, was originally a divinity who presides over and shapes the space or the meanings of where they are. But these days can either be the genius of the designer or the guiding genius of the owner and the designers he used. The term or idea of genius of place has several modern formulations, such as spirit of place and nature of place. Now, the English word spirit certainly acknowledges that the Roman genius, maybe god or fabled hero, was linked to the place and somehow expressed himself or herself there. But today we lack that full repertoire of presiding presences. Thus, in Stuart Owen's Spirit of Place, Artists, Writers, and the British Landscape in 2020, the word proves so elusive, even ultimately vague, that really one cannot understand it. But it has been used very carefully, the phrase genius of the place, by Gina Wouters in her introduction to the new book on the great bird-blind debate. By contrast, Ave Friedman's The Nature of Place in 2022, subtitled A Search for Authenticity, is much involved with the tangible, even factual, the raw materials of built places, elements that for him determine how we respond. And then there is a study of Representing Places by Edward Casey of 2002, who's written actually several studies of place and looks to see how paintings and images might seek to understand and explain places. His first chapter asks precisely, what does it mean to represent a landscape? A question that all the images of planting fields, either from the past or today, invite us to answer. Planting fields is, as the strategic plan of 2020 to 23 states, a place of history. And history, as I also aver, is where the Olmsted values of landscape design remain relevant, and our reflections in our experiences of green spaces today. Sorry, my voice has been going, as you can see, and I can't even get the top off. Emily, can you manage to do that? Thank you. So they argue that the Olmsted values are very important. Now, I'm trained as a historian, yet for almost the past 30 years, I've sought out the exciting and sometimes very precarious balance between history and its current designers. Planting fields is today an assemblage of memories of other places, other styles of building and decoration, and ways to bring into this place images and images of place that are not here, are not even implied here, but are there. That approach via reminiscence, association, and even imagined recollections may prove a useful approach. The coast sought to build on the lines of an English country house. Now, some English country pursuits, like architecture, garden arts, and interior furnishing, did translate regularly into America. This taste here for replacement was for something approaching an English country seat and combined happily with like Eastern Coast images of Gold Coast establishment. Now, English country seats come in all shapes and sizes, from titled dukes like Blenheim for the Earl of Marlborough, where, of course, Brown executed one of his great landscapes, or the Baronet Worsley at Hovingham, where, as you can see in front of the house, cricket is still played, and I have watched it frequently. But there are also untitled folk who are still guarding their estate and long culture without acquiring titles, like Nunnington Hall, now in the hands of the National Trust, which I knew when I lived in the village and I could use the park when the house itself was closed. Or the really very small Lampler Hall in Cumbria, where I stayed on many occasions while walking in the Lake District with a family. Once I was taken up into the attic of the house and shown the naval uniforms that the men had worn in either the Royal or the Merchant Navy. It was 7 centuries of uniforms. Now, another military activity played an even more important and unusual role in the design of parkland. In the early 18th century, Sir Richard Temple, who owned Stowe, later Baron and finally Viscount Cobham, raised a small detachment of soldiers from the men who worked on the estate, and he took them to France to fight against the French. When they returned, the one task they could still exercise was making military fortifications. So, Sir Richard got them to build a ha-ha around the garden spaces, and on my detail on the right shows a bit of the other one where the ha has spikes sticking out to stop the French people invading or foreigners or beasts getting into Stowe. Now, the ha-ha became for Stowe one of the earliest designs that would shape garden spaces. But the ha-ha became a crucial element in shaping land for gardens, protected now from beasts and so on. And in fact, the ha-ha was used originally by Laurie Olin when he designed the surroundings of the Washington Monument in Washington. Now, planting fields does not have any ha-ha. I was very disappointed to learn that. But it involves specific garden moments surrounded by woodlands and open land, referred to as lawns or meadows, as you see in this map. Meadows, lawns, fields. Terms that suggest a different character for each of the views outside. Yet the ha-ha had an additional and important value, that it allowed people within the safety and order of the garden to raise themselves up and glimpse over the ha-ha into a wilder world. And at Planting Fields there was once, alas, now not there, a view from it to the waters of the Long Island Sound. One of the early commentators on gardens said that gardens were an Italian from the 16th century. He said gardens were a third nature. That was because they were based on what he called the second nature, which is what humans do around them, building roads and things like that, and then on the first nature, the primary world of the gods and the wildness, We can see it clearly in all images from the 17th and 18th century, where the immediate garden, the third garden, is juxtaposed to agriculture and then to the wilder landscape behind. I bought some new typing paper and it just sticks together like no one's business. I'm sorry. But I think that this dialogue from the 17th and 18th century, the dialogue between different natures, and there weren't just three, there were three different notions of how landscape should present its natures. These modes and juxtaposition are less visibly announced in Planting Fields, and yet I think they are still there, and as I said, the primary view of the sound has been lost. Some elements of English country seats did not transfer to the east coast of North America, like the outlines of buildings, half timbering, and the medieval type gallery inside. So did the country pastimes of hunting, shooting, and fishing. Cow himself was an accomplished sportsman, and the game room marks that interest. But his clothes for hunting were obviously imported from London, as several photographs in a book make clear that sartorial etiquette was London-based. The interior itself is a blend of taste too. Its interior was furnished largely by Charles of London, but Mrs. Coe, who had been schooled in Paris, was enamored of French furnishing and found material and interior styles there for her reception room, which you can see here. It also displayed Chinese jade work, which you see a bit on the two cabinets that are shown there, and which now have come back to the house. They once were taken away, and you can see a bit. But other country houses did not translate foreign things so well. The Lord or Squire, for example, in England, could always choose to send members to Parliament. I have a feeling today that it would be much better if that's what they did, but that's a different matter. The local landlord would select the local schoolmaster, and he would find a suitable vicar for the local church to ensure a proper maintenance of whatever notion of Anglicanism was deemed appropriate for that part. This nostalgia for country houses produced a wonderful house and garden here, though sometimes the English enthusiasm was either misread, even wrong, but just as frequently inspired. As I said, Coe looked to the Olmsted firm for the garden and parkland. Now, the Olmsted had visited Stowe in Buckinghamshire, and in one of those great estates of England, they thought its design was by William Kent. And that is invoked by the writers of the discussion of the park and planting fields in the book published in 2018 on Coe. And then on the very same page, that writer goes on to pluck that same idea and say, what is being shown here at Planting Fields is Kentian, William Kent, where the Coe, and I quote, grounds were designed in an English landscape garden, a style of naturalistic landscaping invented in the 1720s by William Kent. The park here is a wonderful recollection of such English tradition in its many versions, and it had its origins long before William Kent. Now, it's worth clearing up, especially as it can make more sense of the layout as we see it today, and more of that later. The Olmsted might have assumed that Kent designed Stowe on the basis of his designing several buildings in the garden there, a hermitage, for example. But Kent was also this is his hermitage. But Kent was also a painter, which is one of the reasons that he appeared in the anecdotes of painting in England in a section devoted to the modern taste in gardening. This the Olmsteds would undoubtedly have consulted, the anecdotes of painting in England in the history of modern taste in gardening. But Kent was also, besides being a painter, a theatre designer, and his Stowe Hermitage was either the basis of this theatre design or borrowed from his theatre work. What he did at Stowe was propose buildings like sets on a stage or backgrounds in a painting that help visitors grasp the significance of that particular moment in the theatre or the garden. He did so also at Stowe in another images of the Temple of Ancient Virtue on the far side, and the Temple of British Worthies, which you see in the foreground with a bust of Alexander Pope in the niche. But in neither case did he lay out the surroundings for these buildings. I think part of the experience that planning feels is that buildings and events in the garden are likewise stage sets for the performance, changing over the years for inhabitants and visitors and for social occasions. And the other thing that Kent was fascinated by was statues, which you see here. But the social visitors to these places, the social gatherings in, for example, the wedding for the Coe's only daughter to an Italian nobleman, then a gala in the middle of 1710 in the Italian garden, or today refreshments on the terrace. All of these things change in front of the buildings, which is, I think, Kent's genius in inventing places that would be a suitable background. Now, the invocation of Kent as an inspirer of Coe Parks is wholly understandable, as he has become something of a ubiquitous yet mysterious figure in the history of English gardening. But he took his place in a sequence of known designers, from Charles Bridgman and Stephen Switzer before him, and after him, Capably Brown and Humphrey Repton. Humphrey Repton being the last of those writers who actually published plans of his gardens. Repton, once he decided to take up the mantle of Brown, was given a selection of Capably Brown's drawings by Brown's son. Now, all of these designers invoked parkland as their repertoire, and this is Repton's business card, where you see him working on a park. Now, Walpole, for example, noted that parks dated to medieval times and still existed in later centuries as deer parks, and that their function was to connect those with gardens. And a historian on Walpole notes this and quotes Repton for doing precisely that. In fact, it has a long-standing connection between parks and gardens. Walpole also said that Kent was the painter who would relish the compositions of the greatest masters in painting. This would have included landscapes by Claude and Poussin. And this was why, of course, Kent was included in that last volume of Walpole's Anecdotes of Painting. But another huge influence on Kent was the 9 years he spent in Italy. So it is very apt that the book on Coe Hall from 2018 illustrated the cover of Edith Walton's Italian Villas and Its Gardens, 1904. That is a study of some importance, still among the now many other books on this topic. It must certainly have been a text consulted by the Boston architects Lowell and Sargent in designing the Italian garden for May Coe. Several emphases in Walton's work are relevant here. She's clear that the Italian house, its gardens and larger landscapes are linked, and that this involved the subtle, and I quote, the subtle transition from the fixed and the formal line of art to the shifting and irregularities of nature. Among other items, she quoted a German, Hermann Tuckerman, on the relationship between art and landscape that is reversed today. This artistic progression is something that was established and emerged through the gardens of planting fields. In particular, Walton approved of the Villa Lante, where the terraces and garden architecture are skillfully blent with it, and its recesses are pierced by glass alleys leading to clearings where pools are surrounded by stone seats that slumber under the spreading branches. Now, I always thought that places were essentially singular. There may be others like it, but not identical. Planting fields is a place where many things speak of its owners, rich collections of both architectural styles, interior, and above all, gardens, my ostensible topic today. It is a place that some of you may know well, but for others it is maybe your first encounter with it. What I hope to do is to try and isolate its particular character. And a century later than Edith Wharton, some decades later, in a book called A Backward Glance, she says that a critic needs to penetrate to the very soul of the work contemplated, to plumb the imponderable something that constituted its fullest significance. And this is what we have to do, I think, for planting fields. Which brings me to the landscape of planting field, which is a plan that I took from that 2018 book, and it serves my purpose here for something that I think can be useful. There are three ways to appreciate a place, all 400 acres of it, as here: in a map, in a drawing, painting, or still photograph, and by walking, which I suppose might involve film a movie. Now, a map is essentially flat to the eye. The one that with contour lines will indicate the difference in surface that would be encountered. And the map of planting fields shows on the far left that the path is steep and there's a zigzag path that obviously is negotiating the topography. The virtue of the map is that it shows a large extent, and within it the connections between sections, especially if you do not yet know it fully. But these connections offer a very different experience when drawn or photographed, for they select or even privilege one particular moment. And in the case of planting fields, there are many to choose from. They may hint at connections still to be encountered, or they are glimpsed ahead of where one is, and they draw out specific items and experiences within that section. They are essentially picturesque, and the vote for that aesthetic mode is huge and still among us. But the picturesque eliminates how we move through picturesque scenery, which is always essential in responding to and appreciating landscape as large as planting field. Yet it is hampered, of course, always by my using slides. For one thing, walking allows one to turn around and grasp how one has got to that point. It allows one to retrace one's steps. But the picturesque, often forgotten, is that by the 18th century onwards, it entailed verbal as well as visual responses, sometimes equally skilled and effective, sometimes playing words off against the visual or vice versa, and words might explain what the looking did not fully grasp or apprehend. An immediate sense of the map here is, or any walk through planting fields, it makes a key element and characteristic of variety. Now, variety has always been an aesthetic element to mark landscape. What is awkwardly called formal gardens, Versailles, for example, seems not to emphasize variety, as do in the formal gardens. But all gardens' forms have their own different ways of grasping variety, including Versailles. The trees here as the planting beds provide a wealth of variety, and they contrast deliberately with the built structure. The sheer profusion, what I would call the immediate garden, immediately around the house, is clear when it's encountered in the vicinity of the hall or the manor house. But we should recall that once people lived in the house, it offered them a very different impression from those who visited from the outside. I'm coming out of the house on the left. I'm coming out of the house on the left. I'm approaching the house on the right, but I'm not going to get into it at that moment. And then the immediate garden of azalea walks, rose gardens, greenhouses, daylily and dahlia gardens are dissociated first from open spaces, and then in their turn are drawn by a variety of paths into an extensive woodland which surrounds it in all but a fraction of the surrounding landscape. This seems to me both an acknowledgement of Wharton's sense of the formats of many Italian gardens, and how English gardens developed by design, including inheritance or circumstance, into a juxtaposition of regular and irregular topography and treatments. And that is how I think Olmsted created similar movements in their designs. But the most striking aspect here is of the plenitude of different plants that signals both the fact this is a botanical garden as well as an arboretum. These are clustered to emphasize that the part that is essentially a collection: hydrangeas, hollies, heathers, magnolias, native plants, rhododendra, camellia, cherries, taxus or yews, each of which has its own forms. So I move to two final conclusions. If you've ever been invited by someone to come over to my place, you will learn at first hand who he or she is. For the most part, we tend to declare ourselves somewhat or a lot by what we have around us in our place. So it does not take an amateur detective or personal obsession to be curious about a place, to read into it and interrogate, even mentally, all of its stuff. Planting fields is huge and is an exemplary example of a place that speaks of its owners and its past and present. It's a rich and absorbing encounter, and it takes both an instinct to respond quickly as well as a thoughtful grasp of what such and such item may mean in the family's history and our own. Now, a man who found huge interest and delight in places was John Ruskin. And he insisted that Venice, for example, owed much to the imagination. Now, imagination is not, if at all, a question of fantasizing, but intelligent understanding of what a place can mean, especially in its detailed riches and invitations to respond. In the house and the gardens at Pontingfield, it requires some imagination to people those places with their original inhabitants, ideas, and customs. Hence, it was Le Corbusier who wrote, "We must always say what we see. And more difficult, we must always see what we see." Now, I've shown you this is my last slide, but it is also my very first slide. And I wonder if, thinking of Le Corbusier and Pontingfield, you can see what we now really see about this place, which we didn't before. My wife kindly photoshopped the traffic beacon from the other house to get rid of a layer of meaning we do not want here. We now see that building much more carefully because something has been removed from it. Thank you. I think I assume the bar, I hope the bar is still open. And their food, but apparently I could entertain 2 questions if they're polite. Or not. Well, if you look at my two photographs, on the right-hand thing there is a red traffic beacon, which I took when I was there a month ago. I wanted to use it again, and Emily photoshopped the beacon out. I didn't go back and take another photograph. We just changed the way of looking at it. We see really now what we see. Okay? Or not. Is that clear? I hope so. I thought a joke at the end might help, but maybe not. I think the bar calls and